Welcome, everybody, to Elvis Rings and Nerdy Things. Sam was able to take some time away from parenthood and his new job of taking care of a human to go see the Dungeons and Dragons film, the 2023 Honor Among Thieves. This is not the film from 23 years ago that Sam and I kind of roasted a few episodes back. This is a new iteration of D&D film. Sam, how are you today?
I am doing well. Full disclosure to our listening audience, we started to record this podcast last night, and then my child decided that everything needed to come crashing down, and I was pulled away inextricably from this recording, and only just now did I come back and see that Zoom idled out of the meeting. So Sean, sorry to leave you hanging like that, but we are back. The child is being tended to. The child is in a much better position than it was yesterday. And I am looking forward to talking about Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. If I may say, a significant improvement over the 2000 Dungeons and Dragons movie, and also a significant improvement over the things that we've watched over the past couple weeks. I'm thinking specifically about some of those animated Ralph Bakshi movies.
Yeah, we were kind of in the rough of it there for a little bit. Now we can take a turn for the better. I think overall I enjoyed this film as well. We're going to start with some non-spoilery things. So if you haven't seen the film, you can listen for about the first 15-20 minutes. And then we're going to move into spoiler territory. So if you would like the film to not be spoiled for you, you can pause, go watch it. We'll make it very clear where the delineation between spoiler and non-spoiler is. So yeah, give us a listen, stick with us, and then leave when it's appropriate for you. Or stay till the end if you just don't give a shit if you spoil the movie or not.
Indeed. So right off the bat, I think it's fair to say that we both like this movie a lot. I think you sent me a text saying that you gave it an 8.5 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's my floor. I really like this movie. And for me, the biggest thing was it felt like Dungeons and Dragons.
It felt like a group of friends playing D&D, which is a hard task to attain. And when I say a group of friends playing D&D, some non-spoilery things. Throughout the movie, characters make decisions that I feel are like those really stupid decisions that players make when they're playing D&D, like a group of friends. Then things go wrong, and then they adjust and make a new plan. And throughout the entire movie, I kept having those moments where I'm like, this just feels like a group of friends playing D&D, and they were able to switch that into a movie pretty flawlessly. And like you said, I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. There's things about the movie that I didn't like or wish they would have done better. But for the most part, it was a fun adventure fantasy movie that didn't take itself seriously, that was a good adaptation or interpretation of what Dungeons and Dragons is in the role-playing game. And I think they pretty much knocked it out of the park.
Yeah. We've talked a lot, especially when we're talking about Vox Machina, about the importance of humor in a Dungeons and Dragons fantasy adventure film. And we should really draw a thick line between Dungeons and Dragons fantasy and Lord of the Rings fantasy. In the podcast that we recorded last week, when we were talking about the things about looking back at the Lord of the Rings 20 years after it was released, one of the topics was the humor and how the jokes aren't really as funny. Well, there's not a ton of humor in that base material. And you don't really expect there to be a lot of humor in the kind of Lord of the Rings, this high fantasy, this deep mythology, this really epic struggle. Dungeons and Dragons is fantasy, but it is inspired by pulp. It is, there's elements of sci-fi in there in the base Dungeons and Dragons game. There are references to either contemporary culture or contemporary to the time that Dungeons and Dragons was created, or in modern editions there might be some kind of nods to things that are more contemporary. So Dungeons and Dragons is inspired in a lot of ways by the kind of Tolkien fantasy that Sean, you and I really like, but to hit that tone in a piece of film or a TV show is very challenging. And that to me was the thing that I don't think there was a single instance in this movie where there was a humorous moment that fell short, and it easily could have. I'm thinking of one scene in particular when a character who is very rigid and by the book, you would describe them as lawful good, when they're departing and the way that they leave is commented upon. That easily could have fallen short, but they pulled it off. And it was funny. It was funny in the movie. It was kind of a joke between the two characters, but it was also funny to the audience, which is to what you said. That's what made it feel like a group of friends playing Dungeons and Dragons, talking about another friend, another party member in a humorous way.
Mm-hmm. And there's kind of a reference to Critical Role does this very well, where they mix humor with drama.
Yep.
And this movie does that as well, Honor Among Thieves. And it's different levels of humor. Like, this is very much PG-13. The violence isn't gratuitous.
Was it PG-13 or was it PG?
Pretty sure it's PG-13.
Okay.
You can look it up while I'm talking.
Yeah.
But you have Critical Role, which is, I'll phrase it this way. There's two different styles of D&D gameplay. You have a group of friends that the violence is gratuitous. There's a lot of cursing. It's very crass. To me, that's what Critical Role is. It's one style of D&D gameplay. And then you have Honor Among Thieves, which is a slightly different, more PG-13 form of humor. But both styles, between Critical Role and this new movie, knock the humor meeting drama out of the park. And the entire film, I was just along for the ride, enjoying it. They really do take place. The film takes place in Faerun, so we actually have the Forgotten Realms and like the references to all of that. The very beginning of the movie, they have a large map that shows like all of the place names that we're familiar with, like Icewind Dale, the Sword Coast. The Sword Coast is referenced many times throughout the movie. Just, yeah, really enjoyed it.
I think they mentioned Neverwinter. Like, a lot of the action takes place in Neverwinter. Neverwinter Nights is a very popular video game franchise. I played Neverwinter Nights 2 a lot more than I played Neverwinter Nights, the initial entry, but Baldur's Gate is another city that they mentioned, and there's a very popular video game franchise there. Waterdeep, I think a lot of the video games take place or visit Waterdeep, and Waterdeep is kind of the main city in the Faerun setting. It's where a lot of adventures are set. But this movie, to my knowledge, was not an adaptation of any of those video games or any of the in-books modules that Wizards of the Coast has issued, or any of the many, dozens or maybe hundreds of novels that are set in Faerun. So it really avoided the pitfalls that would accompany any sort of adaptation of a material that is liked or loved among the base audience. But then you can also tap into those things that people are familiar with, the names of the different locations that people have had adventures in, or they've played video games that take place there. So that was a lot of fun. And you didn't need to know Dungeons and Dragons. You didn't need to know Forgotten Realms in order to enjoy the game, because while they mention a lot of those cities, none of the other locations are really that important. Because, and this has been one of my critiques of the Rings of Power, the action is character driven. Everything that happens in the movie is because of the characters trying to accomplish something, and they come up against obstacles, and then they overcome those obstacles by working together or having, moments of growth. There was no instance of, that needed to happen because the writers thought that would be cool, or they tried to shoehorn in some sort of Dungeons and Dragons reference, or they wanted to create this moment. There were so many occasions like that in the Rings of Power. It really drew you out of it. Here, I hate to say it, fell in love with the characters and just kind of saw them go on their adventure.
Yeah, and that's really key, to have a film based on the Dungeons and Dragons material There's so many references in the movie to places, to people, even the dragon. I don't know if this is spoilery because it's the dragon's in all of the trailers, but the dragon itself has a huge backstory.
Mm.
And if you know the backstory when they say the dragon's name in the movie, there's so much context that goes into it, but you don't need to know any of that context to enjoy the movie. There's a lot of references to spells and creatures and people, places like
Elminster, right? We get it.
yes.
Elminster is one of the most famous characters in the Forgotten Realms. There are, again, dozens of books about him. He shows up in a lot of these video game adaptations. He's a major character in any of the campaign settings. One of the characters in this movie is his descendant, and it's mentioned and it's set up who he is, but he's in it for a very short period of time. And it's really just to move the character that we do spend a lot of time with, to move his story forward. It doesn't use the Dungeons and Dragons established characters or lore as a crutch. It uses them to kind of color in a very vivid background. Also, the way that they executed that dragon, we can talk more about it maybe in the spoiler section. So good, right? Because I was scared for the characters, but it was also a really funny sequence. I do want to say something about the set pieces. There were a series of, we would call them in Dungeons and Dragons, encounters, combat or infiltrations or escapes or things like that, they pulled off perfectly. There was a scene where the characters needed to infiltrate a moving carriage, then through magic do some other things, all to get access to a different location. And it's the type of thing where it's so harebrained, you could see a D&D group coming up, this is our plan. And then, they roll well and they succeed. But this movie did that so well. It injected humor and a little bit of suspense, and it didn't come off like a hokey sequence. I'm thinking of a great comparison to the 2000 Dungeons and Dragons movie with the gigantic maze that was 3 rooms. Yes. Right. And 3 very, very mundane, straightforward rooms. Their set pieces were pulled off very well, which you need. And then obviously you can have the plot points and the character development and the conflict in between that. But I really enjoy the action sequences and some of these things that you could see. This would be a roll for initiative type setting if this were a tabletop game.
And we had believable acting. One of the problems that I had with the 2000 movie, we have Jeremy Irons overacting, and then we just have like the Wayans brother doing a 1999 spoof comedy role in the middle of this fantasy movie. So, I mean, I don't want to go back and start to complain about the 2000 movie because we have a worthy successor in Honor Among Thieves. The last thing I'll say for non-spoilery things is just, it's a great piece of material that's based on something, whereas we have other things like another popular piece of game/video game material right now is The Last of Us. And there's a lot of times where The Last of Us is just shot for shot remake of the video game. And and you were explaining this earlier, that they reference characters, but those characters aren't inherently pivotal for the story. So we have completely brand new characters based on a game that they make their own thing. Like this is definitely its own thing, but it feels like D&D, and it has all of those key components to what D&D is. So yeah, for the most part, I'll get into the problems that I had with it, which are very few, but a few problems. Get into those when you get to the spoilery stuff. But do you have anything else you wanted to add in terms of non-spoiler review?
Let's just end this portion. For those of you who maybe have not seen it, please go see this movie. We have not been paid by Warner Brothers or Wizards of the Coast.
Or Hasbro.
Well. Yeah. I mean, these are our genuine feelings. As fans of Dungeons and Dragons, as fans of the fantasy genre, I'm saying we, Sean, I'm speaking for you here, but I think we would agree, we want more movies like this. If there were a cinematic universe of Dungeons and Dragons movies, I'd be over the moon. Kind of Marvel is starting to kind of peter out, right? Let's get that next thing that everybody can get on board with. But
I mean,
that won't happen even if we just get like 2 or 3 more of these, right?
yeah,
That won't happen if this movie does not do well. Please go and see it. It's not I don't think it's streaming yet. Maybe it is on like Paramount Plus. I don't have that.
no,
But
it is,
go to the
it is exclusively in theaters. That's how they're billing it right now.
Oh,
But the important thing is they're already talking about possible sequels. And the thing with Dungeons and Dragons, the game has been around since the 70s. We're currently in the 5th edition of the books. There is so much content associated with Dungeons and Dragons. So if they decided that they wanted to continue this and make it a real franchise, you could have so many, and that's what one of the things that we've talked about in the past, I believe, on this podcast, that I like so much about Marvel in its heyday, in its prime. No 2 Marvel movies felt the same. They all felt like a different genre within a superhero setting. Like when we had Ant-Man and the Wasp, it was a heist movie. When we had Captain America Civil War, it was a spy movie. Like there's so many different things. Or sorry, Captain America Winter Soldier was a spy movie. So you have all of these different realms in Dungeons and Dragons as well, where you could make, I mean, there's so many possibilities. You could go jungle, Indiana Jones, like archaeology movie with pyramids and mummies and the Yuan Ti.
Spoiler, once Haley and I get our hands around this whole baby thing, I would love to dungeon master an Indiana Jones style jungle game with the group that we had a couple weeks ago. But
you could have pirates. You could have some like dwarvish expeditions in the Underdark. There's so much prime material to adapt for film. And what makes me so excited about the possibility is that this movie did a really fucking good job.
Yeah.
So if this would have bombed again, like the 2000 movie, we could have another 23 years of no content. And right now, Dungeons and Dragons is in the cultural zeitgeist. Everybody's talking about it. It's more popular now than I think it's ever been in its existence.
Yeah.
So yes, bravo to the filmmakers. Please go see it, like Sam said, so we get more of this shit. I love it.
I do have one final comment, and that is my theater experience.
Okay.
So it was memorable only because it was not memorable.
So I'll say the last episode, I kind of went on a rant about my theater going experiences. So if you haven't listened to the last episode, please go back and listen, and then you can follow along with Sam's experience.
Real quality stuff. It was a good. I mean, everybody's had a bad movie theater experience, right? It's fun. It's something that unites everybody. So I saw this.
Yours was good.
It was good. I mean, I think there were 2 people in the theater who had very loud, either medicated coughs or coughs that should be medicated. I did not necessarily appreciate that, especially they were so loud. I did, due to the vagaries of parenthood, I also did not eat anything over the course of that day. And I saw the movie at 2:00 in the afternoon. So I needed some food. I made the mistake of ordering a pretzel, and this pretzel came with nacho cheese.
Movie theater pretzel?
I got a movie theater pretzel with nacho cheese, which is the one thing I talked about me not wanting to mess with in the dark in a movie theater, but I did. The pretzel was disappointing.
Yeah, because it was probably fucking microwave.
It was a microwave pretzel with no salt. It was just bread and nacho cheese.
Stale, damp bread.
It was not good. And then I got kind of like the bottom of the popcorn thing. So a lot of my popcorn kernels were really small. And then so maybe I did have a slightly less. Well, here's the thing. At the price point where for the 5, I'm not going to complain too much. If I paid more, I would have expected a higher quality experience. But it for the price was right. Movie theater popcorn. I need real butter, and I need like a not so fine grained salt, because some of those initial popcorn pieces are just way too salty, and then everything else is just not salty enough. So a higher quality popcorn experience would be much appreciated.
See, this is something I didn't reveal last week.
Oh,
I don't like popcorn.
Oh, well.
I know. So for me, when Carly and I go to the movies, we get a small one, and I might have like a handful of popcorn.
I'll say the one thing I regret is not getting Sour Patch Kids. Kind of should have done that, but trying to be a little healthier. Hence why I went with the pretzel. Okay. Spoiler section over. We're going to take a quick break and come back for a spoiler section for the 2023 Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves movie film. All right, everybody, welcome to the spoiler section of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things and our review of Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. Before we begin the discussion, let's get a quick plot summary. Prior to imprisonment, Bard Edgin Darvis served as a member of the Harpers, an order of peacekeepers, until disciples of a red wizard he had arrested killed his wife. Accompanied by barbarian Holga Kilgore, Edgin attempted to make a new life for himself and his daughter Kira by turning to theft, teaming up with amateur sorcerer Simon Elmar, rogue Forge Fitzwilliam, and Forge's mysterious acquaintance Sophina. While raiding a Harper stronghold, Edgin attempted to steal a tablet of reawakening to resurrect his wife, but he and Holga were captured while their accomplices escaped. After spending 2 years in Revel's End Arctic prison, the pair escaped Neverwinter and learned Forge has become the Lord there after the prior Lord fell mysteriously incapacitated. Forge has been taking care of Kira, convincing her that Edgin's selfish greed led to his arrest. Sophina is revealed as a red wizard, and she and Forge deliberately orchestrated the capture of Edgin and Holga. Sophina attempts to execute Edgin and Holga, but they escape and decide to rob Forge's vault and bring Kira home during the upcoming High Sun Games. The gladiatorial games were previously banned, but Forge reinstituted them. Edgin and Holga track down Simon, the sorcerer, and he helps in recruiting Doric, a tiefling druid. Doric shapeshifts into a fly, infiltrates the castle, and finds that the vault belonging to Forge has magical defenses, which Simon lacks the power to disable. Simon proposes that they retrieve the magic relic, the Helm of Disjunction, to aid them in accessing the vault. In order to find it, they travel to a graveyard and ask Holga's ancestors where the helm can be found. We have a comedic scene with speaking to the dead, and eventually one of the corpses points them to a paladin named Zenk Yandar. Zenk Yandar turns out to be a former resident of Thay who fled when the Red Wizards turned his people into the undead. Zenk is willing to assist them only if Edgin swears to distribute all the booty that they retrieve from Forge's vault to the people of Neverwinter. After Edgin agrees to, they infiltrate the Underdark to retrieve the helm. On the way there, meet up with Holga's ex-husband, played by Bradley Cooper. In the Underdark, they find the relic, but are attacked by Thayan assassins sent by Sophina. Zenk fights them off and helps the group escape from a red dragon. Simon, turns out, has trouble mastering the power of the Helm of Disjunction, so they come up with a plan to infiltrate the vault using a staff of teleportation that they recovered earlier. Simon and Holga are able to infiltrate the vault, but find that it is empty except for a trap, which does trap them. And then at the same time that they are infiltrating the vault, Sophina subdues Edgin after disguising herself as his daughter Kira. The group is spared execution for the moment, but is forced to participate in the gladiatorial games. They do so successfully and escape the stadium. They discover that Forge has loaded all of the treasure of the city and the attendees at the gladiatorial games into a boat and is preparing to flee. The group stops him, steals the boat, and rescues Kira. But as they are escaping, they realize that Sophina, the Red Wizard, has used the games in order to complete a magical ritual that will turn all of the residents of the city into an undead army, and then use that to conquer the surrounding area. Realizing this, the group sails back to the city in their boat. They use the staff of teleportation to transfer all of the stolen riches from the boat onto a hot air balloon. The hot air balloon is blowing through the city, dropping treasure. It draws all of the people out of the stadium before the spell of undeath takes effect. As the group returns to the city, Sophina confronts them and they begin dueling. Simon is able to nullify one of her spells, allowing Kira, the daughter of Edgin, to place magical bracelets on Sophina, which negate her magical power. Sofina is then killed by Doric, who is in an owl bear form. However, in the fight, Holga, the barbarian, was fatally injured. Edgin, who has retrieved the Tablet of Awakening, uses it to return her to life instead of his dead wife. The story ends with Doric and Simon maybe beginning a romantic adventure. The old Lord of Neverwinter awakens and declares the team heroes for their saving the city and its residents, while Forge is sent to the prison where Edgin and Holga began the story. And that is your plot summary for Honor Among Thieves.
So just to get my bad things out of the way first.
Oh boy, jumping right in.
Because then we can talk about all the good stuff. I know they put an emphasis on practical effects and animatronics in the movie, which is I'm all for. But there's times where it works and there's times where it doesn't work. The very beginning, when they're in the jail cell and they have that, it's like a orc or something who joins them in the prison cell, and then Olga just like wrecks shit and kills him. But he looked really good. Those were good practical effects. But then we get, and I guess my biggest problem with the effects is the Dragonborn. The Dragonborn looked so out of place compared to everything else. And the Aarakocra did at times too. They just seemed like
really good cosplay.
Or Chuck E. Cheese animatronics.
Okay.
So
yeah, I would endorse this critique. It was a small one, and I think luckily we weren't. There wasn't a Dragonborn or an Aarakocra member of the party, right? That would have been probably just constantly in your face. Mm-hmm. But this was, I noticed that as well.
So there's that. Then there's also the party's tiefling, Doric. I didn't realize she was a tiefling until they said that she was.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to see the tail. I don't know if she had hooves.
She had little horns. Yeah, no hooves.
She had horns. Her skin tone was a Caucasian white person skin tone. Tieflings are like half demon. So give me a real tiefling. And so I was kind of bummed out about that. And then just more diversity in the party. It just seemed like it was a bunch of humans.
Yeah.
Forge was a human. The sorcerer was a human.
No, Simon is supposed to be a half elf.
Okay, well,
but sure. it was mentioned once, right? It was mentioned once, and then it was never talked about again.
They interact with other races. I mean, Olga's husband was a gnome. It looked like
halfling. I think it's supposed to be a halfling.
It looks smaller to me. Looks smaller than a halfling.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they interact with all of these different characters. But I would have liked a little bit more diversity in the actual partying group. And if the tiefling would have actually looked like a tiefling to me, then I feel like I would have been okay with it. But when you don't make that decision and you don't put the emphasis on the sorcerer being a half elf, it seemed and it felt like as I was watching the movie that it was just a party of humans kind of going about their business. So yeah, I wanted a little bit more. But then to your point, the two characters in the beginning that were different character races, like the Dragonborn and the Aarakocra, if that would have been throughout the whole movie, I think I would have been turned off.
Well, and then even the halfling stuff, right? We have one of the members of the committee reviewing people in the prison for pardons. She was a halfling. She showed up later in the film. Bradley Cooper was a halfling. And then there was another halfling that showed up at the end, as in the ceremony when they're all being honored. There was a little bit of uncanny valley with them. You could tell it was a composited shot. Mm-hmm. If we had a halfling in the party, it would have been, 2 hours of that. And that would have been distracting. I agree with your critique of Doric and that, she did not look like a tiefling. She looked like when you go to Ren Fair and people buy those little horns and put them on, like that's what she looked like. I think I saw her tail once, maybe twice.
Yeah, there were only a handful of times where I was like, oh yeah, there's the tail.
And I think she used it. Maybe she used it at one point to assist during the carriage scene. And I think that's when maybe that was one of the two times that I noticed her doing it. And the other time she kind of like flicked. If she did that more frequently, I think it would have been a little bit more memorable that she was a tiefling. And then, yeah, the skin tone, she should have had, red skin or something like that, or blue skin, or like some sort of otherworldliness to it. And she didn't face seemingly any discrimination. That's
for
the
being
other.
part demon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be the other way to emphasize that her otherness would be to, she, the wood elves took her in, but when she's around humans in the city, there's, pointing and jeering and throwing rotten vegetables. We didn't get any of that.
She mentions that she hates humans, and I think her being a tiefling was part of that. But yeah, I mean, throughout the actual, it's one thing to like reference that, and it's another thing to actually show the audience that. And
Yeah.
showing me is much more memorable than just a passing comment early in the movie.
Yeah. I wonder if that was something where they said, listen, our budget is only so much. We need the CGI for certain big things, the dragon fight, the gladiatorial arena, some of the other, spells that we use throughout the movie. We can't have, every frame with Doric where we need to go in and paint her, face digitally. Because the alternative would be to do practical effects,
practical.
which we
Don't do it
saw.
digitally.
Well, we saw the practical effects of face paint in the 2000 Dungeons and Dragons movie, and it sucked.
Well, this isn't the 2000 D&D movie. This is
Yeah, I know.
a quarter century later.
And to be fair, they did have an ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, on board with some of this stuff. So maybe they could have figured out how to do it. But yeah, to your other critique about it just being like the party's basically all humans, I'm willing to accept that because it allows for the kind of fish out of water experience of the audience member. And it would have been harder for the audience member to identify with, the Goliath and the Minotaur and the dwarf characters. And because then that also begs a lot of other questions about like, how are all of these people coming together and, giving them backstories that make sense. We didn't even get a ton about Holga being an Uthgard barbarian. Like that's a very specific culture within the Forgotten Realms. And it's mentioned, she was exiled. And then we meet them when we do the battle, but we didn't get a ton of focus on the implications of ancestry. And I think that might have been slightly distracting, especially for like the first movie. If we get subsequent movies, maybe they'll diversify the cast or the parties in those movies and start incorporating a little bit more.
Well, I don't
fantasy.
need the different backgrounds of the humans. Like, I don't really, just tell me that she's a barbarian and she was outcast. I don't need to know any of the background of her culture. I can get that later, but at least giving me a little bit more depth of the characters that are in terms of like the character races that you can play. That's what I wanted. And I hope I get that going forward, but we'll cross that bridge if we get a second movie. But those were my three negatives. It was basically the animatronics feeling kind of out of place, wanting more diversity of my character races. But otherwise, besides those things, I thought the movie itself was phenomenal. I liked the very beginning, how they delivered that backstory of basically being in their parole hearing, trying to get out after 2 years of being in prison, and having him tell the story. And then it leads, and he keeps saying, well, I'd really like it if Jerathan or whatever his name was here. Because it's also like their whole plan is centered around grabbing the Aarakocra, who can fly. He's like an eagle person, and busting out the window and then flying away and getting out of the citadel or this jail or whatever it was. And then they end up doing that. He shows up, they grab him, they jump out and fly away.
But right as the one guy says, we are going to give you a pardon.
Yeah, I mean, their parole is going to be granted. Yeah.
Which when so the initial sequence, I was like, okay, what's this? The opening shot of the orc being delivered to the prison. I was like, okay, this is kind of like Dungeon or Jurassic Park kind of opening where you got all these guards, you got this cage and this thing's being on, and then it slowly kind of revealed, okay, just a prison. And that was kind of your stereotypical when Holga beats him up type thing. I've seen that before. It was kind of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 to me. But then the humor in that pardon session was my first indication. Okay, this is going to be good. They're hitting the right notes here. It was kind of the cliche way to start a fantasy thing, right? You start in prison. You're prisoners, right? Isn't that how every
prisoners are a tavern?
Prisoners are a tavern, right? And actually, we got kind of both of those because that's how Holga and Edgen met. They met in a tavern, and then we meet them as prisoners. It's like how every Elder Scrolls game starts. but they did it well. They did the tragic backstory well. Oh, I've got a daughter. My wife was tragically murdered. I couldn't stop her. Yeah, that was to me the indication that things were going to go, that this was going to be good.
In the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They pulled off the tropes well. They did the humor well. And the performances were great. Chris Pine, throughout, he does a really good job of being both earnest and humorous and pulling off kind of tongue-in-cheek without being condescending. Like you never got the sense that he was too good to be in a Dungeons and Dragons movie.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which you could easily kind of get that with other people.
Because he has the line when he's talking to Doric, and she's like, "Okay, what's your job?" And he goes, I plan, I make the plans." And she goes, "Okay, well, the plan's made. What do you do after that?" And he goes, "Well, if the plan fails, I make a new plan." So she goes, "Oh, so you make plans that fail?" Well,
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, he kind of plays like the straight man / party leader, but what does he really do here?
yeah.
And everybody has that D&D group where someone kind of takes the lead and is the person that communicates with NPCs, and they show up to the king. One person's going to talk. That's a natural development within a D&D party. And it just seems like this is that character.
Yeah.
If he was a bard, I wanted more bardic magic. They didn't really give us any of that. There's a couple times where he plays, and so we could talk about magic in this instance, because there's times where it's done really well, and I love how they don't always tell you the spell that's being cast.
Mm-hmm.
And if you play D&D, you can, so there's the moment where they're fighting Safrina, and she, at the very beginning of the battle, she casts a spell called Meteor Swarm, which if you play the game, you're like, oh yeah, boom, Meteor Swarm. A very deadly spell that wizard can cast.
9th level spell, right? Like top level, like that's the most powerful level of spell that you can get in the game.
Yeah. So she cast that pretty intense spell. And I knew what it was. Carly had no idea, but you don't need to know. And that's what we were talking about earlier. You don't need to know these things to enjoy it. So that was a very good use. The Speak with Dead sequence was fucking phenomenal.
That was
hilarious.
So good. And they, for better for worse, they released an extended clip of that as a trailer, but it was only a portion of that entire sequence. Yeah.
When they got to it, I was really bummed out at first, because I was like, okay, yeah, here it is. We're getting it out of the way. But then when it turned out that they ask like 30 different, and it's so funny how they're always like, oh, I died and then I handed it to this person, and then they go to that person.
Oh, I'm Sven. You want my brother Sen or whatever it was. It was so good.
Because he right before the battle, he took a bath and slipped and broke his neck. That
was the best one. Yeah.
That whole sequence was perfect.
And that to me is something where if I'm a D&D group, and if I have theoretically an item that allows me to continuously cast Speak with Dead, or, at that point, let's just say spell slots don't really matter that much. If I need to get that information and I know that somewhere in this graveyard is somebody who can get me that information, I'm going to dig up all the corpses too. It was so well done. And the type of thing where if this were a dramatic movie, they could not have pulled it off, right? It wouldn't have made sense. Whatever it was in the moment, though, that was the Dungeons and Dragons experience.
Yeah. But where I wanted more, Olga never raged. She's a barbarian. That's like a classic barbarian thing. I would have liked to see her go into a frenzied rage or something like that.
Let's say, I bet the screenwriters were like, this is her raging, but they didn't have any sort of effect, right? I'm thinking about when they're going to be executed in the street, and she uses the block to beat people up, and then she gets the axe. And then later on, when they're in the forge,
but
fighting,
in those moments, she just looks like she's fighting.
Exactly, and that's the thing. They didn't do anything to.
They didn't have her screaming and going into a barbarian rage, which was missing, and I just wanted that. Otherwise, she's just a fighter to me.
Yeah,
she's not a barbarian. So we have that. We have Edgin as whatever he is. If he's a bard, if he's a fighter, I don't know, because they plan him out to be like this harper agent. So he could be a fighter, he could be a ranger or something, and he just, because he gave up on the harpers, he's not doing any of that, and he just starts playing his lute instead. But if he's a bard, I wanted more of that, and I didn't really get any of those, like giving inspiration or magic coming from the lute. And we get that with Critical Role, with Scanlan. Like, his portrayal of a bard is phenomenal.
Yeah, I had a similar thought, because there were points in the movie where I was like, okay, this is basically Edgin giving inspiration to somebody, right? It's like giving inspiration to Simon, giving inspiration to, I don't know if he ever really gave inspiration to Doric, but there was no indication that something magical was ever happening when Edgin was engaging with the world. And even the music, he didn't really, I think there was one song that came up multiple times. I don't remember any of it.
It was right after Bradley Cooper.
Okay, it kind of was like a traveling song or something like that.
But like lighten the mood.
That is a critique that I buy. I think they just didn't want to blur the lines between what Sophina and Simon are capable of and what everybody else is doing, which, for the purposes of adapting D&D into a wide release movie, I get. You're not going to get a perfect representation of a barbarian rage mechanic or a druidic, or what's it called? Bardic inspiration mechanic, right? The one kind of nod to those things was when they were doing the Speak with Dead. It's like, you can only ask 5 questions, and Doric's like, oh, that's kind of arbitrary. It's like, well, that's the game designers balancing this ability. So yeah, it wasn't a perfect depiction, but it was a good adaptation. And
I'm just hopeful that if there's future sequences or sequels, that they adjust a little bit and give us a little bit more, and there's room for that growth. Maybe we didn't need it all in the first one, but that's just my desire down the road. Maybe we'll get some more.
Well, so for instance, there's a really great scene where they distract guards to infiltrate the castle, and the distraction is an illusion of Edgin playing his lute. And it turns out that Simon cast the illusion, and then he gets trapped in a pothole and his concentration breaks. We get a really great representation of a spellcaster losing concentration and the effects on a spell that he's trying to maintain. That easily could have been Edgin using that, casting that spell, mirroring himself. But they just, I think they probably just said it's going to be easier to say Simon is the magic user. Let's not confuse the audience. Edgin is just a guy. He's got the planning. He's, he can help out in a fight. He's the talker. Doric is the shapeshifter.
And I could be totally wrong. Edgin might not be a bard. The next one, he could totally be a fighter. But yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
And I think just they didn't want to overly complicate it. I mean, we also, Sophina, if she's casting Time Stop and Meteor Swarm, technically she's like 17th level at the lowest, and that would probably, seems like she would super outmatch the abilities of these other members. But again, we have a movie that is not a perfect adaptation or not a perfect representation of D&D, but a good one.
And my last thing with magic is, you mentioned it as a teleportation stick or rod.
Yeah, I think.
But they call it the hither thither stick, which perfect D&D group coming up with their own name for something.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely is probably named something else, and it's probably a reference to a completely different object in the D&D world, but just the name they gave it was awesome. And I just thought that was really funny.
I mean, it's such a great D&D spell magical device, right? It's not perfect. It's got limitations. Oh, it's quarter mile range and, can only be someplace I can see. But they use it effectively. And that's the type of thing where I think some dungeon masters are just of the opinion, I'm going to put this thing in the game, and I don't know what they're going to use it for. Just let your players' creativity run wild with it. Like I remember Matt Colville, the YouTuber, in one of his campaigns, he gave his team a portable hole, or he gave his players a portable hole, which is similar to a hither thither stick where you get a kind of a pocket dimension, and he didn't really know what they were do with it. Turns out they used it to completely bypass huge chunks of his game because everybody climbed in the portable hole. The rogue folded the portable hole up, put it in his pocket, and then snuck through the entire, in the entire dungeon. Turned out that meant that his players were significantly underpowered for things that came in later in the adventure, but it was an interesting use of a piece of magical or magical item. So that was a really fun thing. Sean, what did you think of the paladin character, Zeng?
I thought he was a great representation of an NPC who comes in, who might be overpowered for the adventure quest that the party's on, but they come in, they offer assistance, and then they leave. So, and that's what he does in this movie. He shows up. He's the one who received the helm like 100 years ago. He's kind of in retirement, it looks like, in some
retirement / hiding type thing.
In a fishing village, saves a tabaxi from fish mouth. That's how we meet him
or something.
Yeah. So we give that, and then he helps assist going to the Underdark and getting this helm. That's where they fight Thembershow, the large ancient adult red dragon, whatever it is, that has this huge backstory. But yeah, I thought he was great. I really enjoyed his dry paladin, lawful good.
Yeah.
Character.
Well, you said it. You said lawful good, right? That was the encapsulation of lawful good, and it's a really his scenes with Edgin were that great dynamic of the lawful good paladin and then the chaotic neutral, chaotic good bard or rogue, and figuring out how to work together. And just we referenced it in the spoiler or the non-spoiler review, but his scene at the end when he was walking away and he walked in a perfect straight line, including like walking over some rocks that he could have easily walked around. Just a really great way to communicate that this person does what they mean, or says what they means and means what they say, and they even walk in perfect straight lines. So it was fun. And then I really thought that he was going to be more of a member of the party. Like I was kind of expecting him to show up at the end and help in the fight, the big clash at the end with Sofina, because he at least had some sort of backstory tie-in to the Red Wizards. I was kind of surprised that he didn't show up, and I kind of like the fact that he didn't, even if it would have been a fun way to kind of save the day.
And I think they'll use him if there's sequels in different capacities. It'd be hilarious if he was just another NPC, like assisting in the quest, and then was just in it for like a portion and then left again. That'd be really funny. What about monsters? And one of the complaints I had with the 2000 movie is that they used monsters just to be like, hey, this is D&D, see, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And we kind of got that with the use of beholders.
Oh my God, that was the worst.
Who were kind of just dumb guard dogs, which are the complete opposite of what they actually are. But in this movie, we got gelatinous cubes, we got displacer beasts, we have an adult ancient red dragon. So I loved the use of monsters in this movie. What did you think?
Agreed. They were great. I thought it's such kind of a cliche to have the gladiatorial setup and then combine that with the maze, but that would be a great setting for a gelatinous cube. And they use the gelatinous cube kind of mechanic really well, using it to escape the displacer beast. I've actually never fought a displacer beast in Dungeons and Dragons. I've never used one as a dungeon master. So I do not recall that they could project an image of themselves. And I can't remember, and I don't know off the top of my head if that is true to the Monster Manual lore with a displacer beast. But I thought those are also really good creatures to use in that setting. I really liked what they did by using a pudgy, fat red dragon. So its flight was basically minimized.
Well, there's a whole backstory to that. So
I don't know it. I my little bit of research, I know that dragon appears in the Out of the Abyss module, but I haven't played it, haven't read it. What's the backstory with this?
Yeah,
dragon?
so Thembershow kind of.
Also, by the way, it sounds like you're saying Thunder Chode, but I know that's not the name of the creature. No.
Thembershow or Showed. It's Thember, Thember, Chaude. So this dragon in the Underdark, his backstory, more or less, he was in the city of one of these Underdark cities, and his flame basically lit the forges for this town. And over time, he grew and matured as a dragon, and he goes off into his own like lair, and he's basically fed sacrifices or slaves to appease him so he doesn't attack the city. And that's why he gets so fat, because he's just constantly fed. And that's the whole joke.
Oh, okay.
Is that's why he's so chubby and all that. But what they do in the movie, and that's what it might not be, it might be canon, it could be canon, that apparently at some point Thember Showed has gone and changed layers. The group just discovers him or comes upon him. So yeah, that's the whole backstory. And it's a pretty robust character to include in the movie. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you don't need to know the dragon's backstory, but if you do, it gets you really excited when they say his name and you're like, oh gosh, I know so much about this character.
So I knew nothing about him going into the movie. And they did a good job of showing and a little bit of telling about the dragon. You could see all of this, the mountain of skulls and bones. You got the indication that obviously a lot of beings have been consumed. The dragon's obviously fat. You get I think it's Zank says, oh, he must have changed his layers, indicating that he wasn't normally here. And then you kind of see how his breath weapon works. And that was a fun kind of callback to the Simon's abilities. Yeah, I thought that was great. I liked the use of the mimic in the maze. That was fun. I think that was one of the trailer shots that we'd seen before. As far as other creatures go, they didn't, what we didn't have was a ton of, and I appreciate this, we didn't have a ton of random things kind of shoved into the movie. The use of monsters was appropriate for their setting. Maybe the one thing would be the intellect hours that they encountered in the Underdark, but that was really more of a humor moment instead of anything else.
Because he says they're attracted to intelligent creatures, and then they just walk right past
they
him.
walk right by him. Yeah.
But that's a cool reference, though, because those creatures imply that there's mind flayers in the Underdark and all of these other beings. So, I mean, it just opens the door to all of these different movies and content that they can give us.
Yeah. All right. So let's maybe hit some of the smaller things that jumped out from the movie. So maybe kind of this is the Easter egg portion, but there were a few things that either I picked up on or I suspect. I'm sure there were things that you picked up on or that you suspect. So let's talk about them. Starting off with the flashback that we get to the initial raid on the Harper treasure room. We see Sophina grabbing an item. That item is then later shown in the flashback to the ultimate villain, Zast Tam, using it to channel this undead ritual. And then later Sophina uses it again. It is a black and red horn. Sean, is that the horn of Orcus?
I don't know. I wouldn't have even put two and two together.
Okay. That was my thought.
I will say I wanted more of the real big bad. They only really show him once when he's talking to Safrina.
Oh, but that was so well done.
It was so creepy.
I agree.
Yeah.
But it was so good where he kind of just starts appearing out of the shadows. Oh, it was great.
Of like this, he kind of looks like a zombie lich type.
He's a
creature.
lich. In the lore, he's a lich.
But yeah, that's the only time we ever see him outside of the flashback when he actually is successful in turning a whole bunch of people into undead. And maybe he's the real BBEG for a bigger storyline and he's going to come back. But yeah, I loved his use. Creepy little bastard. But yeah, it was good.
All right. What are some little things that you picked up on that we want to highlight for our audience?
When we first see Simon, there's a Critical Role reference to the new campaign that they're on. Sam Riegel's character is FCG, Fresh Cut Grass. And there's a moment where Simon is doing like these little magician tricks, trying to get some money from the crowd while he's also stealing from them. And he kind of does something with his hands and he goes, "Oh, do you smell that? That's fresh cut grass." And that is a reference to Sam Riegel's character that he plays, a little automaton who's named FCG, Fresh Cut Grass, because his owner named everything after her favorite smells.
So that got my hopes up that we were going to get a Critical Role cameo. And I was under the impression that the Critical Role cast was in this movie in some way, shape, or form, but that turned out to not be the case.
Yeah, before I went, I saw that Matt Mercer had tweeted saying that they are not featured as a cameo in this movie.
I wonder if at some point they were, but they just cut it.
Could be.
I was looking for them. I thought that they would be characters in the gladiatorial games, that they would be one of the groups
in the maze.
In the maze, yeah. Which they were not.
How good would that have been if they were all dressed as like their characters from a Critical Role campaign?
It would have been great. Now
because then you could leave it open to interpretation that they survived. You could have them all like not show them get killed because they had the one group who was in the cage.
Yes. Now,
as they were leaving,
do you know the significance of that group?
I don't know.
So I did not know. I had to look this up. I will say that when I was watching it, I noticed a few things about that group that seemed a little anachronistic. I think there was a haircut at one point. There was like, what? That's a strange haircut. I think it was like a bob, like kind of a Velma haircut from Scooby-Doo. And then in one of those final scenes that we get with them, one of those characters was wearing a pair of like very obviously, contemporary glasses, like plastic horn-rimmed glasses, whatever it was. So then I looked it up, and that group are the voice actors from the 1980s animated Dungeons and Dragons show.
Oh, cool.
And they're dressed up as their characters from the show. And so if you go back, you can look at screen grabs. I think they had there's an acrobat and a barbarian and a cavalier, and they're all very kind of 80s pulp costumed. But that was a little Easter egg for those fans of the 1980s Dungeons and Dragons cartoon.
Well, what else? My notes are done.
More.
I've gone through all my notes.
Did you see the Tom Morello cameo?
I don't even know who Tom Morello is.
The guitarist for Rage Against the Machine?
Oh, no, yeah.
So he is a Dungeons and Dragons fan. He actually plays in Joe Manganiello's home game, along with, I think Vince Vaughn plays, maybe Kevin James, and then at least one of the Game of Thrones.
No, both Benioff and Weiss.
Oh, they're both in it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So that's too bad.
What a powerhouse D&D group.
I guess that's the best gig that they can get right now. Not a whole lot of writing, directing opportunities, but they can play D&D with Joe Manganiello. And so I saw Tom. I'm 99% sure I saw Tom Morello in the stands of the gladiatorial arena as a audience member. And then that dwarf who was eaten by a displacer beast.
Mm-hmm.
That is also Tom Morello in heavy makeup, and that is his character from the Joe Manganiello D&D game. Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, and I did not see Joe Manganiello's name anywhere associated on the credits. Full disclosure, I stayed for the entire credits until the Paramount logo came back up when the theater lights came fully up, because I heard that there was a post-credits scene. There was not, but I did not see Joe Manganiello's name anywhere, and I thought
there is a post-credit scene.
There's a mid-credit scene with the corpse.
Yeah, where they don't ask the fifth question.
Yeah,
so he's still alive.
Yeah, which that was fun. But I thought I was anticipating that Joe Manganiello would have a role, a cameo, or something in this movie, because I know he has been a big proponent of getting this movie made, but that did not pan out either.
He is directing a D&D documentary, though, so
cool.
Be on the lookout for that.
We maybe can discuss that later on. Anything else, Sean, about Honor Among Thieves?
No, that's it. Just go see it. It's a very good movie. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is a good movie. Go see it.
You're just going to reiterate what I was saying.
Sorry, I'm just, at the point we're just trying to say things.
Well, you can follow us on Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things on Facebook. You can email us at elvesringsnerdythings@gmail.com. You can subscribe to us if you want us to get better, and you can give us some funding to do so. You can find that on our Buzzsprout subscription page, which is located on our Facebook page. Sam, do you have anything else you want to talk about? Otherwise, we will coordinate and plan and figure out what we're going to do next week.
Yep. Stay plugged in, everybody. In the meantime, go see Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. We want more content like this. It is good for you, good for me, good for all of us. And with that, goodbye.
Bye.